Bob and I worked really hard on that introduction, so welcome to all of you. It's good to have you here on this lovely day. There's a lot of things you could be doing right now, but you're here, and I commend you for that. We are going to talk about traditional marriage today, and I'll introduce that in just a minute, but before we do, let's have a word of prayer and kind of center our thoughts and minds. Good and gracious God, we are so grateful to be the church. We're so grateful to be your people, working on building bridges of understanding and peace, focusing at worship on building bridges with those of different generations, and also talking about building bridges with those in a variety of traditions in terms of human sexuality. We ask you to bless our time, to give us good conversation, to allow us to hear and understand, to grow in your love and in love for you and in our understanding of each other. Bless our time. In Jesus' name, amen. A couple of years ago, not that far away, we had a marriage amendment vote in this state, and there was a lot of politicking back and forth about a variety of things. And we set up some respectful conversations here at church, and we gathered people together, and we talked about that marriage amendment, and we talked about marriage in general. And I remember one of the comments, I won't mention this person's name, but he just kind of had a look in his face like, you know, I'm okay with this conversation, but I guess it begs the question for me, how do I better understand what marriage is? And we've been having some conversations since that time. Last year I had a forum on marriage in the Bible, and that's an interesting journey. It really is. If some of you were there, I'm sure you were, and you remember every word we talked about. But it's an interesting journey. It's not just as simple as saying that marriage is a man and a woman in the Bible, because of all the different things, especially in the Old Testament. Certainly by New Testament times, it's moved in the direction of marriage between a man and a woman. But it doesn't mean it's a simple question to answer when looking at the Bible and looking at society. And today we're looking at marriage in our society, and I invite you to be part of this conversation. I was looking for a book, and I stumbled upon this. I think it was recommended somewhere, but I was looking for a book that makes a case for traditional marriage. The title of it is, What is Marriage? Man and Woman, a Defense. And it was written in 2012 by three people, and I can only pronounce some of their names. Sharif Girgis, and he's on your sheet there, PhD candidate in philosophy at Princeton. Ryan Anderson, a PhD candidate in political philosophy at Notre Dame. And then Robert George, a visiting professor at Harvard Law School. I want us to have a conversation about 5 of their basic tenets in this book, and we'll spend some time laying out those tenets. They can be very complicated. It's not a real long book, but the arguments are dense and they're complicated, and I had to read it, several parts of it more than once to get the gist of what they were saying. But so we will have those tenets put forth, and then we'll have you spend some time talking in your groups about what you think about the tenets they're putting forth. And we'll probably write some of these up on the board, and we'll make some comments about those. Next week we're going to have a forum that's decidedly different. We'll be making a case for same-gender relationships. And Paul Bai from Zumbro, who happens to be gay and is getting married in a couple of weeks, will be here to tell his story and to talk about that experience. So that will, I'm sure, be a stretching, good experience as well, as we hear from Paul, and Paul shares a story that he's not afraid to talk about, but yet he hasn't had much opportunity. So the two of us will be up here together. If anything, I hope I'll give him a little moral courage, because it's not that easy to stand up. As nice as all of you people are. Can be a little hard. So some background. Does everybody have a handout, by the way? Everybody have a handout? If you need one, raise your hand. We got a person right here that could use a handout. Anybody else need a handout? All right, thank you. Some background. The core arguments of this book were first published in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. So this is not just a little religious book in the corner of the marketplace. This is a bigger marketplace out there in public for all to read and debate. This is not a religious book. And I want to say that's a good thing. And the reason I'm saying that is it would be really easy to find a book that makes a case for traditional marriage that's a religious book. And it would be basically saying, okay, we read the Bible this way, and this is the only way to read the Bible, and now get in line. And I didn't want a book like that. I wanted a book that raises traditional marriage to a larger scale from a non-religious point of view. Nothing wrong with a religious book. I just that's too easy an argument to go down and then just go our separate ways. And this is a book that's non-religious, non-biblical, so we'll be starting from a more human and basic, they would argue, innate point of view. The authors would argue, point 3, that no society has seen marriage as anything other than a conjugal partnership. If we're going to leave that behind, they would say we had better have clear and convincing reasons. So that's really kind of at the heart of their points. They are not against homosexuality in general. They really aren't. They don't make a value judgment. They don't make a moral judgment on that. They're not against same-gendered relationships. They just don't think it rises to the level of marriage. So we'll talk about that today, and you can weigh in on how you feel about that. And then ultimately the authors defend the principle that marriage is a comprehensive union of mind and body that unites a man and a woman as husband and wife, and it is ordered to family life. All right, so far so good? Some of this stuff will get a little complicated, so if I'm going too fast, let me know. But that's kind of the gist of where we're going, some of the background behind this. Now, just a quick covenant, because I think these conversations can be tricky and they can be deeply personal. And so I would want you to covenant or make an agreement with each other to do certain things, to really speak only for yourself. And when you're speaking for yourself, to use I statements. To practice speaking and listening with respect. Accept that others in this room are going to have different points of view than yours. That's just normal. Fill up a room full of people and we're going to have a variety of thoughts and feelings about these things. Be brief in your comments. Refrain from interrupting. Listen to understand, especially when something is hard to accept. Suspend judgment. And then I think, in my opinion, because of my background, the last one becomes almost the most important. Refrain from getting caught up in questioning the religious commitment or fidelity to Scripture of those with whom you are speaking. It's so easy for Christians to begin to wonder, well, how Christian could they really be? How biblical could they really be? I don't want to do that. I really don't, because we come from a great big wide Christian church, and there are 5,000 denominations in this world for a variety of reasons. And I don't want to sit and cast judgment on all of those that might not agree with me in my thinking of the Bible and the world and the church. Okay, can you live with that covenant today? Sound okay? All right, thank you. So here's the author's essential claim. There is a distinct form of personal union, historically called marriage, whose basic features do not depend on the preferences of individuals. Let's just stop right there. I think they're making a case for saying, what we would probably say as Christians, that this is a God-given relationship. This is a God-given situation. They would call it innate or by nature. But they want to argue that it's fundamentally something that's built into the stuff of the world, into nature. So it's fundamental. It doesn't depend on a particular society's decision to describe it or even change the definition. They would say that it's innate. It calls for permanent and exclusive commitment. It has long been a fundamental social reality, prized by individuals, couples, and whole societies. But it is also a moral reality, a human good with a structure which is inherently good for us to live out. Okay? Yes?
Just a question on the preferences, the way you've read this. Are they talking about sexual preferences, or are they talking more broadly? Kinds of preferences of individuals?
Yeah, they're just, I was trying to explain myself. I don't think I explained that particularly well, but they're just saying we've come to a point in the road where we're trying to change the definition of marriage. So that would be the preference they're talking about. And they would argue that the traditional marriage, as we know it, what they're going to call conjugal marriage, is something that's innate. It's written into the fabric of nature, the world as we have it. Does that make sense? So
Yes, it does.
our preference would be to change it, and they would say that's not a good thing. Okay?
Thanks.
Any other questions on that definition? All right, let's go on. And this is kind of the first tenet or thesis statement that they would have. There are two competing views of marriage. They would call the first one the conjugal view. Marriage is a comprehensive union of mind and body. The comprehensive union is something only a man and woman can form because of gender complementarity. It is a union of will, by consent, and of body, by sexual union. It calls for permanent and exclusive commitment till death us do part. Okay? That sounds like a traditional view of marriage, perhaps as it's been lived out in this country. They would argue, and really quite forcefully, that you cannot call something a marriage if it does not involve a sexual relationship. Now, let's not go down that road too far. But it's complicated, right? I mean, what happens, I had a wedding of a sister and a couple of sisters, and they were both in their 80s, and they got remarried. And I have no idea the nature of their relationship, but they saw it as a marriage, and they wanted to speak their vows to each other and deepen their relationship by speaking those vows. And so it can get complicated sometimes, but they have a definite bias for saying that sex has to be a part of marriage, or it's really truly not a marriage. And I think that becomes one of the ways that they define marriage then. It's not a couple of people over there, former college roommates, that are continuing to live together. It's specifically defined by that union of will, by consent, and body, by sexual union. Okay? And then the next one is what they would call a revisionist view of marriage. Marriage as the union of two people who commit to romantic partnership and domestic life. It's essentially an emotional union. Such romantic unions are seen as valuable while the emotion lasts. Permanence and exclusivity are optional. Till love do us part. Do you remember back in the late 60s and early 70s? I love talking about the 60s and 70s with my pastoral staff because they weren't born then. So, and I sound wise, or else maybe like an old fuddy-duddy, but whatever, that's beside the point. I remember back in the 60s and shows like All in the Family, 70s, where they were starting to use the phrase, till love us do part. Do you remember that? I do. What's wrong with you people? No. You didn't watch television, okay. Well, I was watching TV, and it made a profound impression on me. I thought, till love us do part. I don't like the sound of that very well. And I think these authors would say, we didn't like the sound of it very well either. Now, I'm the moderator here. It's not my job to straighten out any of your thinking, so much as to ask these questions. But I do remember how odd that sounded when it first came out. It was a shift in marriage culture, even back in those days. So what I'm asking you to do is find some people around you, 2, 3, 4 people around you, and have a 3-4 minute conversation on each of these tenets. The first one being, so how do you respond to these two definitions? Do you agree? Do you think they're full of hot water? The basic premise doesn't hold up? Talk about that for a few minutes. Let me call you back. You don't have to alter it. You can be, just get comfortable.
It's not death,
but not too far away from your hearings. So we have a couple of microphones here. If people want to address this, Harlan's got a mic and Bob has a mic. I would ask you to keep your comments succinct and to the point, but tell me how you respond to these definitions. Yes, Jim, go ahead.
So, so there's no reason to think that,
Not on.
the term revisionist is being used here as a pejorative term. But there's no reason to think at all that a revisionist view of marriage is bad. First of all the gay people that I know would strongly endorse all of the things in the first point except for man and woman, and they would reject all of the things in the second point. Secondly, even allowing for that, the term revisionist is being used as a pejorative here. And our current views of what we would call traditional marriage are highly revisionist. So just to take an example, in Deuteronomy 21, one biblical view of marriage involved the forced marriage of women prisoners of war who then had to sexually submit to their husbands, to their new owners. And today we would not call that traditional marriage. That was a biblical view of one form of traditional marriage. We would not call that traditional marriage. We would call it rape. Yet it happens today, and we do call it rape. So another way in which the highly revisionist view of traditional marriage involves my marriage to Cindy, right? Not long ago, that was highly illegal in many parts of this country within my lifetime. If we'd entered the state of Virginia prior to 1967 as a married couple, it would have been a felony. And the last law against our kind of marriage wasn't overturned by a state until this century. The year 2000, in a state ballot measure, and 40% of the people voted to uphold the law. So there are still places where we are from a highly non-traditional marriage. Looked at this way, revisionist could be very good.
Explain your marriage. Some people may not.
So
know.
Cindy's a third generation Japanese American. So I'm in an interracial marriage. So.
Thank you, Jim. So basically you're arguing that it can sound problematic to use that term revisionist, but it doesn't have to be when you look at historical patterns. We have revised marriage, and some of it's been to the good, is what you're saying. A lot of it's been to the good. Yes?
Yeah, we looked at those two, and whether you use conjugal or revisionist, we weren't certain that was a real good term on it. But if they're ending up going in a direction of same gender relationships, at least the ones I'm aware of, would fit more in the first category.
Okay.
The till death do us part. And we thought that was a huge difference between the two. And there are plenty of people in men and women who would fall in the second, till love do us part. And if it's 2 years, that's going to be a long marriage for us.
Yeah.
So it doesn't separate that way, at least in our way of thinking.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because really they're talking about marriage. They're not talking about same-gender relationships.
Correct.
So let's make sure that we're not importing that into this conversation. They want to make a case for conjugal, traditional marriage. So we'll take the same gender out of it completely for most of these conversations.
Right, and we think that till death do us part
Works.
is important, at least going into it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we're not basing these definitions on Hollywood, but yeah, you can't help but argue that there is less than permanence for some people as they enter into, especially as they're driving into Vegas and then driving out of Vegas. There's less than permanence on the mind of some people. If you got married in Vegas, I apologize. Other comments along the way. How do you respond to these? Yes, Ann? It'd be helpful if you say your name. I think that's helpful.
Hi, I'm Ann Beatty. I've spent a lot of time, thinking about these two definitions like you. I've just seen them for the first time, but it bothered me in the first one that they make no mention at all of emotion. And it seems like, a traditional marriage is based on love and emotion.
Yeah, and is that a bad thing necessarily? And I think you'd argue that no, it's not. But we think about how far we've come, though, that motion seems to have more to do with it than perhaps it did in other times and places, times of arranged marriage, those kind of things. Other thoughts? Cindy, third generation Japanese American.
Our table talked a lot about the fact that the revisionist was based on only emotion. And that, at our table, we have some people that have been married for many, many years. And that life isn't always fun. And but they made a choice to be married and to love one another till death do us part, so they work through the hard parts. And so we talked about how love is an emotion, but it's also a choice. And that our intellectual choice carries us through those hard parts. And then the other thing we talked about was the importance of commitment, which seems to be lacking in the revisionist for the long term.
Yeah, whenever you try to define things, it's so easy to get so specific, and then really, you're not talking about commitment in the second level at all, and that there's got to be people, even in the revisionist part, that have emotion involved that want it to be till death do us part. There's got to be. And other things. One more comment, and then we're going to move on. Arlene?
Erlene Wicker. We also talked about how not being married doesn't mean there isn't commitment and emotion and a sexual partnership, because sometimes the laws, or sometimes it's a financial decision. I hear that more and more with people my age that, for whatever reason, pensions or divorce settlements or whatever, they're choosing not to marry but to have a commitment.
They are. And that happens all over the place these days. And we're not always sure how to understand it, are we? This is good to talk about. It really is. Point number B, we're going to move on. According to the best available sociological evidence, children fare best overall when reared by their wedded biological parents. Not only does child rearing deepen and extend a marriage, children also benefit from marriage. To make marriages more stable is to give more children the best chance to become upright and productive members of society. Moms and dads are different. We should disavow the notion that moms can make good dads and dads can make good moms. The two sexes are different to the core, and each is necessary, culturally and biologically, for the optimal development of a human being. So this is a sensitive topic. Let's be honest about that. There's a lot of shapes and sizes for families today. And my goal is not to make anybody feel bad and guilty because of they might have a different situation that they've gone through. But I want you to talk about the importance of children being raised by their biological mother and father. Take about 3 minutes to do that in your groups again.
With a different man,
And we're back.
and she was making her living
Talk to
by
me about
the child support.
their argument that children fare best when raised by their wedded biological parents. We have, well, we'll start with Al back there.
Hi, I'm Al Johnson. As the parent of 2 adopted daughters and 3 homegrown sons, I totally reject the argument that children are best raised by their biological parents. Anyone who's been adopted, and not to say that that's always great, but in our case, it seems to have worked out pretty well.
Yeah, it's so easy to make this a blanket statement. So we have Alicia there.
Hi, I'm Alicia. I absolutely agree with what he just said. I have kids in my neighborhood that come to our house, and you can hear the screaming from their biological parents on a constant basis, and it's heartbreaking. But when they come to my house, I make sure that they know that they have a safe place to go, that they have people in their lives that care about them. And I think that if a child has a strong role model, somebody that encourages them and loves them, that's the best thing that can happen for them. Obviously, the parents being the good role model is important, but I think just it's our role as adults to always be there for children, no matter if we're the parent or not.
Thank you. Others?
Thanks. This has actually been addressed. It's in a fairly scientific fashion. So, the American Academy of Pediatrics is the professional organization for pediatricians. The vast majority of pediatricians belong to it. Your child's or grandchild's pediatrician probably belongs to it. And in their journal, a highly respected journal, one of the top journals in all of medicine actually, 2006, they reviewed the pertinent medical literature in this regard and found that unequivocally there was the children raised by same-gender parents do as well as their peers. They said civil marriage is a legal status that promotes healthy families by conferring a powerful set of rights, benefits, and protections that cannot be obtained by other means. If you're interested in the study, let me know. My name's in the directory. Give me a call. I can get you the reference. The claim that the best sociological evidence that we have supports biological parents comes from really one study by a professor named Mark Regeneris, excuse me. It's been heavily discredited. Just to give one example, it was funded by the Weatherspoon Institute, which clearly has an anti-gay marriage agenda, which in and of itself might not be. It's a little problematic, but it might not be the death knell of the study. But the problem came when Regeneris claimed in his article that they had nothing to do with the formulation of the study, the analysis of the data, etc. And it later came out that that is flatly not true. Now, in my business, I just so happens that that's one thing I do. I've published over 80 peer-reviewed articles, many book chapters, etc. in medicine. And I can tell you, when you engage in that kind of dishonesty, it's game over for the credibility of your study.
No.
Yeah, again, it's back to the adoption issue. For those of us who were adopted, when my biologic mother would have been about 15 years old at the time of conception. And the downside, I will say, of my adoption was that I'm an Italian who was adopted by a Swede and a Norwegian. And I didn't find out about garlic until I was 10 years old. And Nick Lowell brought up the other thing is that they would have discussions without moving their hands, and I'm incapable of having a discussion without doing that too. But I ended up with two very loving, caring parents. I will say the negative things, having to do chores before you go to work and before you go to school, things like that. The importance of education, the importance of work. So to say that it is biologic parents is that I had just an absolutely wonderful childhood, except for cleaning out some of the barns when I was growing up. That was amazing.
Thank you. I want to go on to the next one. Time goes fast. And this is a little bit longer point, but basically the third point is related to the second point. These authors think it's very critical that we promote a strong marital culture. This is point C. I'm not going to read all of it, but I'll read parts of that. Civil marriage between a man and a woman has been regulated by almost all cultures. Why? Because these relationships alone produce new human beings. For those new and highly dependent people, there is no path to physical, moral, and cultural maturity without a long and delicate process of care and supervision, one to which men and women typically bring different strengths. Let's skip down. The authors claim that changing the definition of marriage will inherently weaken our marriage culture. No arrangement will be held up as ideal. They really work hard to say, and again, we could disagree about how we define marriage, but they would work really hard to say that our culture, in many ways, has really slipped, if not fallen apart, when it comes to casual commitments to marriage. I don't find that many people that casually commit to marriage. I think people go into it with their hearts and souls, but we're talking about theoretical people, and we're trying to define what people hold as most important as they go into a relationship. And they would argue that by changing the definition, we're not holding up this ideal as something that all of society can look at, emulate, and live into. Okay, are you with me? You see at the very bottom, under the central problem, in redefining civil marriage, it might make it more socially acceptable for fathers to leave their families, for unmarried parents to put off firmer public commitment, or for children to be created for a household without both a father and a mother. I mean, I don't know if all those things lead from the thing before, but you can't help but argue that the changing nature of family today is somewhat alarming at times. And so I think we just need to say that out loud, and then let's talk a little bit about that. We're not going to have a ton of time, but what do you think of the author's argument? Do we need to do more to support a strong marriage culture? And if so, what would this look like? I'm going to give you about 2.5 minutes to talk about this, okay? And we're back.
Just like Hillary.
Let me speak personally about this issue, supporting a strong marriage culture. You know, we do a lot of work with couples in premarital counseling. We do something called Prepare, and we get together and we talk about strengths and weaknesses of a couple, and we try to follow up with a phone call or two after the marriage is done. But I'll be the first to say that we get busy and we get new marriages coming on, and there's so many things to tend to in the parish. And studies show that about the vast majority of couples that do get divorced in the first 5 years. And we need to do more for those couples. We need to do more to build a strong marital culture here. So I'm very sensitive to this argument. It is very important. However we define the nature of our relationships, to give couples the strength that they need to work on their relationships and be strong going forward. Very important in my mind as a pastor. Other thoughts that you had? I knew I should.
Pastor Nick do you mind telling them what you told us in our little group?
I felt for some time that we as clergy have given something away by just becoming officials of the state. And it hasn't necessarily strengthened marriage. Because so often I think you talk to clergy and we really feel used. People need a place to get married, and this is one of the things that the culture is saying, this is what you do, and there's no intent of carrying on with a strong religious faith life. So the European model that still looks good to me, and I know there are probably many that disagree, and that is that there would be a civil ceremony, and then after that ceremony, the couple could come to the church with their family and their friends for the blessing and for the celebration of this lifelong commitment that they are making, and the blessing of family and friends and God. I think that could strengthen marriage,
Okay.
rather than what we have today.
All right, thank you. Other thoughts that you have? Let's move on to the next question. I'm not going to give you as much time, but as point B, the authors argue that if emotional union is the primary basis for marriage and not sexual complementarity, okay, are you with me on this one? One would be revisionist versus conjugal. Then there is no rational basis for limiting that union to two persons. This is kind of the slippery slope argument. Okay? It's not totally out of the question. You hear lots of thoughts about this, and Mormons, have basically put polygamy totally out of the picture of what they originally practiced, but it is part of their culture and tradition, certainly a part of the biblical tradition in the early days. So here's a question. It's not an easy question. How do you define marriage? And does it involve only two people, and why? So I'll give you about 1 minute and 45 seconds to define marriage and solve this issue, okay? Talk about that.
I got my story.
A corollary for this argument is the question that the authors ask, and it's a good question. Is marriage endlessly malleable? It goes back to Jim's comments about revisionist thoughts about marriage, and I think at the other end they want to say we get a little uncomfortable with that sense of it being malleable to the point of unrecognizable. So it's a fair question, I think, and it's a good question. I don't think we're going to be able to give the definitive definition of marriage today, but I want to hear what your thoughts are. How would you define marriage? Who does it involve? And you know, lest we think this is easy, I mean, we relate to Christians in Tanzania. There is polygamy in Tanzania. You can visit a boma, and there'll be a person there with basically a hut, a place to live in the middle of the man, and maybe a primary wife or just the man by himself, and then 4 women with littler huts on the outside. It's not that far away from where we are. Muslim men in the Quran are allowed to marry up to 4 women. Again, you have to live into the societies of which you're a part, but we're not that far removed from vastly different traditions. So define marriage for me. For all times and places.
I have a brief, can I say
Go ahead,
something?
sure. Yes, you may. Who are you?
I'm Bob. In my mind, marriage in our society is between 2 people who are emotionally attracted to each other, but then make a willful declaration of union for the rest of their lives. So it's a combination of both.
Combination, and conjugal and revisionist. You'd want to combine the strong features of both.
Yeah.
Okay?
So if Bob can say something, can I say something?
Hey, go ahead, Harlan.
I think the slippery slope that's happening is people choosing not to get married at all, or choosing to have their careers established and their lives established and their money in the bank, and now we're old enough to have kids, let's have kids and get married, or get married and have kids. So I think it's a totally different slippery slope that's being defined in our society. Well,
It is definitely a changing culture. I always ask couples when they come in for premarital counseling, why do you want to get married? And it's interesting to hear their answers. And a lot of them aren't any good. I'm making a valid joke. That was a cheap joke. But you can tell, they kind of say, well, isn't that what people do? And so then, Jason, you know what I'm talking about. I'm not making this up. And this is what we struggle with in a culture where they're not sure if they want to get married or not, or if it's even worthwhile to get married or not. I really appreciate what the authors had to say about a strong marriage culture. We could do a lot in the church to lift up some of those things. Gretchen, go ahead.
I was going to say,
who are you?
I'm sorry, Gretchen, boss. I have 2 kids, and they always say, why do people get married? And so we always tell them you have to really be in love and make a good team. Because one without the other really just doesn't seem to be a good idea.
Okay, so that the emotional part and the commitment part, both. Okay? Other things about marriage and how you might define it.
you've got me wondering what I told the pastor at age 20 when he asked me.
We've got it written down. We've got it written down. It's all there.
I'll spend the rest of my day on that.
Yeah, you know that baptism, funeral, the record keeping, no, it's all about what they tell the pastor. Yeah. Just kidding. I want to ask one more question. These are very thoughtful answers, so thank you for sharing them. And the last one, we're not going to have time to get in our groups, but I think it's worth talking about briefly. According to the authors, states that recognize only traditional marriage do not necessarily diminish the social status of same-gender partnerships. And it's a very careful argument that they make. I don't want to just dismiss it out of hand. But you see if you agree or not. As long as same-gender couples know the clear and compelling reasons that society has for promoting conjugal marriage, again, they're trying to build up a strong marriage culture, then they are free to form any partnerships that they see fit. We're back to the same-gender couples. Just don't confuse those partnerships with marriage, they would argue. The authors are convinced that if people in society are motivated by bigotry and hatred toward same-gender relationships, any change in the legal status is not likely to affect their thinking. So what do you think about their premise? So what do you think about a legal status for the relationships of gays and lesbians? Are there some we haven't heard from today that are wanting to make a point on this? What do you think? How important is it? Yes. Sarah?
Sarah, I just wanted to point out that their thing about saying here, where they say any change in legal status doesn't change thinking, sort of contradicts their statement back the page before, where they say laws tend to shape beliefs and beliefs shape behavior. So
you were reading between the lines and they skipped right over that part. It's hard to make an argument and have it all fit together. I'm the same way. I just hope my sermon fits together from one end to the other. And this is a 95-page book, so yeah, there's going to be some holes. They do, yes, Alicia?
Thank you. I disagree with their statement. I think that laws do change the way of thinking. I mean, slavery, Abraham Lincoln made it a law. He had it amended. It changed the way of thinking. Women got the right to vote. It changed the way of thinking. We're obviously that people are going to have their own opinions. They're going to have their own mindset. They have every right to, but I think that if a group of people can feel supported by the majority of their fellow human beings, it makes a big difference.
Okay, thank you. Other thoughts? Other thoughts about this? Cindy?
I think as long as we have privileges associated with the term marriage, that you can't deny those same privileges to same-gender couples. I guess that's it. You just can't.
All right, thank you for your thoughts today. I want to summarize, and I promise it will be brief. I'm very glad that I read this book. I was looking for arguments on traditional marriage. I'll keep looking for them. A lot because of those respectful conversations and that ongoing question. So what is marriage today? And how do we define it? And what's at the core of the relationship we have? Very glad that they talked about the marital culture that we live in and some of the challenges of that marital culture. That they hit the church front and center almost every week in some form or another. We have to talk about these things. We have to support as we can, as pastors, as Christians, as we're on this journey together. I'm glad that they raised questions about, so what really makes a relationship, and how much are we committed to each other, and how do we better begin to define some of these things going forward. There were a number of things that I found very helpful about this book. I didn't find all of it without contradiction, so Sarah, I would agree with you. But I applaud them, and I really do believe them, that they're not bigoted. They were not raising this topic to be bigoted or with some sort of axe to grind. Now, they had a particular interest in saying traditional marriage has been important for a long time. If we're going to change that, we should have a good conversation about it, a strong, healthy conversation about it. We're not always going to agree. We're not. That's just normally. Yes, Dick?
Well, Vern, to my knowledge, church attendance has been on the decrease over several years. And if that's true, where else are we going to get conversations to deal with traditional marriage and all the other ills that we have in our society? So how do we change the course of action if we don't have basically the church being, I guess, the cornerstone of how we can deal with some of these issues? The problem is it's a lot of like preaching to the choir, because the people that you would like to have a conversation with don't happen to be here.
Yeah.
So I feel it's really a difficult challenge to see traditional marriages. Most of us grew up and know it, and now we even have, well, you can see it in our own neighbors or relatives, what's kind of changing. And the marriage is, people are waiting till later in life, somebody mentioned it, to get married.
Yeah. I want to cut you off, Dick. You're making a very good point, and I'm glad you're making it. I'm just sensitive of our time. And I think we're making the same point, maybe from some different angles, but at that point would be, they would argue that it's very important we as a culture have these conversations, but you're right, there's very few places in our culture to have these conversations. As we build bridges of understanding and peace in the church, I think we want to create an atmosphere where we can talk and wrestle with the important questions of life and civilization and culture together. And we can walk away saying, peace be with you, even though we don't always agree about the answers that we gave to some of those questions. So that's my hope and dream for the church of the future. So many churches go off and they do their separate things over here and over there, and I would rather be a church that's more of a marketplace of ideas and thoughts and inspiration. We haven't plumbed the depths of marriage here, but it's very important. That's why I'm holding up this book and arguments like it to say, we got to talk about marriage and traditional marriage and what that means, what it means to be in relationship with our culture going forward. So I want to thank you for participating in this. Very important. Thank you very much. Come back next week.
Just a comment. Not easy to go through a complex discussion of a book in a respectful manner in 1 hour, but somehow Pastor Vern did this.